Vorrengarde, Aranel-the Faye Dancer. Copyright Harvey Heath, 2025. Written by Harvey Heath. This is a short guy, only 3 chapters, but I enjoyed it. Hopefully you do too. Full stories to be published to Amazon in the near future. Chapter 1. The Theft of the Prism. Part 1. The Silent City. Eruhal's crown rose from the plain like a chalice carved from winter. Terraces of glassy stone stepped upward in concentric rings, each ring etched with lines that caught the moonlight and pulled it downward in narrow gleams. At the summit, a dome of translucent crystal held the night sky at a careful distance. The whole city shimmered, not with life, but with arrangement. Streets met at measured angles. Water ran in quiet plains that seemed to hesitate rather than flow. Even the wind slowed when it touched the latticed spires, as if uncertain whether it had permission to pass. Aranel watched from the shadow of an arch and allowed his breathing to lengthen until his ribs settled against the rhythm of the place. He wore the linen and soft boots of a traveling musician, a lacquered flute wrapped in oiled cloth at his hip. A hood concealed his hair. The hood was not necessary, but habit made him cautious. It had been years since he had walked as an elf among strangers without a weapon poised against his back. The habit had kept him alive long enough to learn grace from peril and laughter from grief, long enough to meet a man who carried the weight of a world and called it a promise. Heath had not taught him how to dance. He had taught him why one dances at all. To avoid death, unlike Heath, Aranel was not immortal. Nor was Heath graceful, but they found a middle ground. A bell rang somewhere above, a clear note that lifted through the streets and returned from 50 surfaces with polite echoes. The sound indexed the hour as surely as a scribe's mark. Windows brightened in sequence, bridges glowed. In the plaza ahead, a procession began in perfect lines. Cloaked figures moved toward the lower terraces, their eyes casting off soft, prismatic colors, white and blue where civil functionaries walked, red and purple where the architect's legionnaires kept pace in the shadow lanes. The colors flickered inside their irises like slow lightning caught behind glass. Aranel stepped into the flow and let it carry him. When a guard's gaze turned his way, he shifted his weight and became a man with a destination who had no reason to be noticed. The guard's attention slid past. Aranel did not smile. His face held a stillness learned in long hours of practice. The wilds had taught him to move like water. The architect's cities required an art closer to stillness than motion, an art of being the exact size the space anticipated. He could do that now. He had learned how to shrink his outline until it mapped to the vacancy of a corridor. At the heart of Eruhal's crown, a festival was beginning. Lanterns ignited in concentric circles that matched the rings of the city. Musicians gathered on the outer steps of the central dome, pipes and lutes and silver bells looped with wire. Aranel reached for his flute with the light, distracted touch of a man about to tune. The wood was old, the mouthpiece smooth. He allowed the cloth to fall away an inch. No one looking would notice the faint seam in the flute's body, or the way the padded case was double-lined. No one would guess the case could be reversed and fixed under a tunic to protect a crystal shard that should never have been made. He heard the old voice in memory. Every order begins with one broken rule. Heath had said it without ceremony, sitting on a ruined step while the smoke of a burned village drifted like gauze. The words had settled somewhere deep. Aranel had not understood then what rule he would break. He knew now. He had crossed continents to be here. If he succeeded, the wilds might breathe again. If he failed, the wilds would burn more slowly, but they would still burn. The procession thickened as he neared the lower stairs of the dome. A pair of hollow sentinels stood bracketing the gate. Their bodies were woven from hair-thin strands of metal, each strand humming in faint harmonies as if a bow moved across them. They held staves fashioned from the same woven metal. Their faces were not faces. They were patterns configured to resemble acceptance or denial, depending on the need of the moment. Tonight they had been given celebration. Their patterns formed something like a smile. A steward with a collar of articulated plates moved down the line of musicians, ticking names on a slat of light that unrolled from his palm. Aranel met the steward's eyes as the man reached him. "Name," the steward said, his tone mechanical with efficiency. "Varen," Aranel said, because the world had a sense of humor, and he fed it when it asked. The steward's finger touched the light, and the slat rippled. "From where?" "North Road. I play in patterns." Aranel lifted the flute with a modest angle that promised competence without pride. "Patterns," the steward repeated, and the slat produced a notch that faded in place. "You stand on the third ring. Do not vary the meter. The city will correct you." "I will listen," Aranel said. The steward moved on. The hollow sentinels made no motion to stop him as he crossed under the gate and onto the stairs that spiraled the dome. The music was already rising, threads of sound that joined and separated in polite geometries. Aranel took his place on the third ring, between a man with a shallow drum and a woman whose bells were tied across her fingers. He raised the flute and let the first pattern through. It was a simple measure that echoed the spacing of the city's terraces. When he played, he folded a second pattern under it, so faint that it drifted under hearing. The second pattern moved 5 beats for every 4 of the first. The two ran together without friction, but somewhere beneath the smoothness a quiet seam formed, and that seam would widen if a man knew where to press. He watched while he played. The geometry of guard shifts broke like a curtain and reformed. Runners moved between stations with small slips of cold fire cupped in their hands. The red and purple eyes of chaos soldiers marked the shadows. Their movements were sure. Their weapons were clean. They were men and women who had traded the friction of doubt for the comfort of structure. The wilds did not offer that bargain. The wilds knew doubt as a necessary companion and called it the doorway where wisdom enters. Aranel played and let doubt sit beside him. The old fear rose. What if the prism of unmaking did more than unmake the architect's hold? What if it unmade a thing the wilds could not live without? Then he remembered a different voice, a girl with a crown of twigs and a laugh like water over stone. Lythra had not been an arch-fae then. She had been a scout with sap on her hands and venom on her knife. She had said that balance is not a law, it is a motion. The motion needs someone to lead it. If you stop, it stops. So do not stop. He finished the first section and allowed the second to begin. The city shifted tone in reply. Lights in the dome brightened and narrowed. He felt the hum in his bones. He had not come only to play. He had come to listen for the seam he had cut into the music. When the seam opened, he marked the moment and closed his eyes, letting the lower pattern swallow the upper. The dome responded. 1,000 small speakers embedded in the crystalline arches answered with a whisper of phase. For a heartbeat, the whole city seemed to breathe out. Aranel lowered the flute. The drummer beside him lifted a hand, steadying the communal tempo. Aranel returned the nod, then set the flute to his lip again, and offered a flourish, as if he had simply taken a quick breath. He did not look to see if any steward had noticed the fold in the measure. He knew the fold was there. He had felt it pass like a fish beneath a boat. When the piece concluded, a ripple of polite approval passed through the terraces. Aranel slipped away while the next measure assembled. He kept to the outer curve of the ring, and walked with the speed of a man who has been sent to fetch water. The architecture guided him. Every 8 spans a narrow stair cut through the ring, dropping toward the lower courts and the service corridors that burrowed beneath the plaza. He took the third such stair and entered a passage that tasted of rain. The air cooled. The light shifted from white to a soft blue. He let one hand drift across the wall as he moved. The wall felt polished and faintly warm. The warmth pulsed with a cycle he recognized now that the flute's patterns had tuned him to it. The pulse corresponded to the widening and narrowing of the seam he had made in the festival's music. He moved when the pulse widened, pausing when it narrowed, until the corridor opened into a chamber with a shallow pool and a ceiling formed of interlocking hexagons. A pair of hollow sentinels stood before the far arch. These were not configured for celebration. Their patterns had been shaped into calm refusal. In the pool's surface, their reflections overlapped and reformed, creating fleeting faces that never steadied. Aranel studied the positions of their staves and the angle of the arch. The arch carried a script etched very near the threshold. The script moved, swapping one character for another like a flock of birds turning in unison. He crouched and unrolled a small bundle from beneath his tunic. The bundle held wire, a pair of thin picks, and a flask of pale oil. He did not reach for the picks. He reached for the flute. The mouthpiece unscrewed with a soft click. The body separated into two pieces that balanced easily in his hands. He fitted the lower half with a short length of braided cord and a ring that could be pulled tight around a post. He fixed the ring at the base of the nearest hex panel. Then he stood, lifted the upper half of the flute, and played 3 notes as gentle as breath. The air shifted. The hexes in the ceiling rotated a fraction, changing the chamber's resonance. The hollow sentinels leaned. They did not step away. Their staves hummed and brightened. Aranel played another run of notes, this time building the hidden pattern 5 to 4, 4 to 3, until the seam reappeared. He caught the seam with a sequence that did not belong in the city at all, a little river song from the wilds that children learn before they know what learning is. Nothing moved for 3 heartbeats. On the 4th, the script around the arch hiccuped. There was no other word for it. The characters stuttered in place and flashed in a color that did not belong to the city's palette. The hollow sentinels swiveled toward the arch as if to check its health. Aranel moved then, not with speed so much as with certainty. He crossed the pool without touching the water. His boots found the narrow line of dry stone that ran like a seam from one side to the other. He slipped between the sentinels as their heads turned and set his back to the arch. The script recognized a shape that matched its rule and opened. The air thinned and tasted of metal. Aranel stepped through and felt the passage acknowledge him, not as a guest, but as a disruption it had not been taught to refuse. The corridor beyond descended. The walls were layered glass with veins of dim light between. He moved quickly but never ran. Running was an apology to panic. He would not apologize. At an elbow turn he stopped. Silence gathered like velvet. He pressed one palm to the wall and whispered, "For the breath you are about to save, thank you." He did not know if the wilds were listening in this place, but he had learned that thanks was a form of magic, even in cities that claimed magic was only geometry with better manners. The passage gave way to a low room with a table of polished stone and a niche on each side. The niches held clean tools and a tray of thin wafers whose edges were engraved with numerals. Aranel took one wafer, notched at 7, and slid it under his tongue. It tasted like cold air. When he breathed out, his breath did not fog. He would need that later. Beyond the room, the architecture changed. The floor began to slope so subtly that a man might walk 100 steps without knowing he had lost height, but Aranel could feel it in his ankles. He counted his paces and let his body carry the measure until the slope flattened. Before him, an aperture opened like an eye. There were no doors. There was surface, and then there was not. He put his hand through the knot and felt the air beyond like water against his skin. A guard stood inside the threshold. The guard was not a sentinel or a man of the Legion. He was human with a set to his shoulders that spoke of long hours and longer obedience. His eyes were neither white and blue nor red and purple. They were brown, and in them a tiredness that had begun to sand away the edges of his face. Aranel held very still. The man looked past him down the corridor. For a moment the guard's gaze slid across Aranel's outline, as if his body were a wrinkle in the passage's light rather than a figure. Then the man's eyes focused. His mouth opened. Aranel did not draw the curved blade that hung like a line of shadow at his side. He stepped in and touched the guard's elbow as if greeting a friend. The touch broke the man's reflex. Aranel's other hand came up and took the man at the back of the neck with a pressure that forced him downward without pain. He met the man's eyes with quiet and said in a voice that did not carry, "Sleep." The word was not a spell. It was a suggestion placed at the exact moment the guard's attention had lost footing. The man faltered. Aranel caught his weight and lowered him behind the threshold, arranging his limbs as if he had slid into a doze on a watch he would regret later. He reached into the man's sleeve, felt the rigid line of a key woven into fabric, slid it free and let it rest where it had been. He did not take it. He did not need it. He placed 2 fingers to the man's temple. The pulse was steady. He did not move for a count of 20, listening. No alarm. The chamber breathed as before. He pushed through the aperture. Cold rose from the floor like breath at winter dawn. The chamber within had no corners. It was a sphere whose lower third had been cut flat, the floor formed of black glass veined with a faint, slow light. In the center, a cage had been raised from threads of glass that did not meet. The threads hovered inches apart, humming in relationships engineered to intercept anything that tried to pass between. The prism of unmaking floated in the center of the cage. It was smaller than rumor deserved. It might have been a heart. It might have been a knife's shard polished by a careful hand. Its color did not belong to any spectrum Aranel had seen. It looked like absence given shape, and that shape shed a halo that made the surrounding air seem thicker. He stood very straight and did not step closer. If he stepped with hunger, the prism would taste the hunger and anchor to it. He drew a breath that filled the lower span of his ribs and let it out. He undid the second latch in the flute's body. The cavity opened. From within he drew a length of dark cloth, wound around something thin and bright. The bright thing was a sliver of mirrored silver cut to a narrow point. The point would not cut flesh. It would cut light. Aranel raised the mirror silver and watched the cage across its surface. The threads were set in a sequence of intersections that changed with a slow rotation. He tested the sequence once, twice, then offered the tiniest measure of the river song beneath his breath. The threads leaned toward the sound. Their intersections widened. He did not put his hand through. He sent the reflection instead, angled so that the mirror silver carried an image of his hand to the space where the prism hung. The image touched the aura. The aura pushed back. He felt the push as a pressure against his teeth. He smiled then, a small, private acknowledgement of the world's consistency. He adjusted the angle and offered no sound at all. In the silence, the cage settled toward its resting geometry. At the point of stillness, he introduced a single breath and a single note, and a motion of the mirror silver that reflected nothing. The nothingness passed between the threads and touched the prism without touching. The chamber changed. The hum climbed. The glass in the walls darkened. Behind him, the aperture shivered. The sleeping guard did not stir. Aranel moved the mirror silver with the patient care of a man shaving a whisper from a reed. The prism slid along the invisible surface he had created between reflection and air. It came forward half the length of his hand, then a finger more. He kept the angle. He kept the silence. He did not let his eyes flicker towards the door, even when a pressure like weather rose under his skin and told him the city had felt something it could not explain. The mirror silver took the prism's weight. The weight was not physical. It was the weight of attention. A coldness threaded his bones. He stepped back, and the threads of the cage tightened. He retreated in small increments, keeping the reflection aligned until he reached the threshold. The prism rested above the mirror silver like a drop of dark water poised on a leaf. He turned and saw the guard on the floor with his head lifted an inch. The man's eyes had opened and narrowed. He saw Aranel and the delicate thing hovering above the mirror. His mouth shaped a word that would become a sound that would become an alarm. Aranel placed his boot softly against the edge of the aperture. The glass accepted the pressure and became surface again. The word inside the guard's mouth became a cough trapped behind his teeth. Aranel knelt and put his hand against the man's shoulder. "I will take it far from here," he said in a tone that several teachers had called kindness and several enemies had called venom. "You will wake and swear you dreamed the quietest theft in the world. Go home when they let you. Live while there is time to live." The man's focus swam. He tried to lift his hand and failed. Aranel held his gaze one beat longer, then eased the aperture open and went back the way he had come, carrying the prism on a blade of reflection no wider than a breath. The corridors were not empty now. The city's hum had shifted into a continuous note that set the hair along his arms on end. Runners moved at a pace just below a sprint. A hollow sentinel paused where two passages met and turned its not face toward him. He altered his gait by a fraction and raised the flute's lower half as if to ask a question about the next measure. The sentinel oriented toward the dome above and resumed its patrol. Aranel held the mirror silver steady in the cradle of his left hand and let the prism's gravity pull against his wrist. His knuckles grew cold. He did not adjust for comfort. He kept moving. At the pool chamber, the two sentinels had gone. The water lay calm as a polished eye. He crossed by the dry seam and reached the stair that spiraled toward the festival rings. The music above had changed. The measure had gained an urgency that pretended not to be urgency. He climbed and reached the outer ring in time to hear the stewards begin the correction. Their hands moved in precise gestures that told the players to tighten tempo, to eliminate variation, to become the city's plan. He stepped into a narrow space between two pillars and pressed his back to the cool stone. He slid the mirror silver and its hovering burden into the double-lined case, holding the reflection steady so the prism did not touch any surface. He pulled the cloth over the mouth of the case and buttoned it once, twice. The case felt heavier. The heaviness was not absolute. It was intention meeting intention. He lifted the flute in both hands and became a musician again. He moved with the tide of players as they filed from the ring to the side stairs that delivered them into the lower streets. Outside, lanterns made small constellations along the canal. A boy darted through the crowd with a tray of bread. A woman with bells paused to fix a strap and then hurried on. Aranel let the flow take him to the ash-grey bridge that crossed to the west gate. At the midpoint, he stopped for the smallest fraction and looked down. The canal's surface reflected the dome and the concentric lanterns. The reflection trembled where a current tugged. He traced the line of the current and saw where it slid under a maintenance lip and entered a culvert. To the left, a guard post waited, 2 soldiers at ease, their eyes bright with prismatic red and purple, their hands resting on weapons that needed no testing. To the right, a vendor's canopy billowed. Aranel did not drop into the canal. He tapped the underside of the bridge with the toe of his boot, counting. On the 5th tap, a faint answering click returned from inside the stone. He set the flute case against his ribs and pressed his palms to the rail. "Keep breathing," he said under his breath. And though no Fae stood within 10 streets to hear him, He addressed them anyway, as if his words could cross distance the way a flame crosses silk. Keep your steps beneath the leaves. Keep your eyes on one another. I will bring this where it belongs. He slid onto the rail and let himself fall. The drop was short. He caught the maintenance lip with his left hand. The flute case clapped to his chest with his forearm. His boots found a ledge no wider than 2 fingers. He did not look up. He did not look down. He leaned to the right and reached into the darkness of the culvert with the mirror silver. The reflection drew a narrow band of light onto the wet stone. The band found a seam in the mortar. He pressed. The seam released. A slab shifted inward with a sigh that only another thief would have heard. He entered and pulled the slab after him. Water whispered past his ankles. The tunnel ran under the festival terraces and into the city's older bones. The air smelled of old chalk and newer paint. Rats used these ways. So did maintenance workers who believed themselves alone. Aranel moved with the same care here he had used in the vaulted chamber. Care was not a costume. It was a way of honoring all the lives that would be spent if he misstepped. He walked until the water fell away in a thin sheet. He crouched and let it play across his knuckles. It was cold, and the cold steadied him. He was a long way from the wilds and the silver trees, a long way from a girl with petals in her hair who had become a commander with a city's hope under her skin. He was also near because he held a thing that had tied the wilds to a certain fate, and he had teased that knot loose. The city above shifted again. The hum became a tone he had heard only once before, the night Heath had walked into a storm and dared it to remember who had named it. Aranel reached a junction and chose the left turn where the slime was thinner. He counted 9 breaths, then 7, then 1. The tunnel ended in a hatch. He pressed his ear to the metal and heard nothing except the threaded patience of a world that had been taught not to make mistakes. He twisted the wheel and the hatch opened onto a storage room. Crates, coils of wire, a folded ladder. He stepped through and closed the hatch and put his shoulder to a crate and moved it across the seam. He stood with his hands on the wood and closed his eyes. He let the steady pressure of the crate against his palms remind him that bodies move things. Not laws, not patterns. Bodies. He thought of the Fae bands that would be waiting for whatever sign he could send. He thought of what he would say to them when he saw them, because words could put breath back in lungs and light back in eyes. He whispered the words now, not to the crates or the walls, but to the feeling in his chest that had learned courage 1 heartbeat at a time. You will make it through. You will step where the roots are strongest. You will not spend yourselves on walls that want you to crack. Move, breathe, hold one another. I am coming. Footsteps clicked outside the storage room door. Aranel opened his eyes and let the calm return. He raised the flute and set it under his chin as if testing its balance. The door latch lifted. A steward stepped in with a tablet of light unrolled in his hand. He looked up and saw Aranel and exhaled, a small surprised sound. 3rd ring. The steward said, We have a revised sequence. You were not where you should have been. I was sent for oil. Aranel answered. He lifted the flute with a rueful tilt. The joints catch when the air is cold. The steward's mouth thinned. He gestured with the tablet. A line of text scrolled. Return. The city is adjusting for a harmonic. We will need all players present. Aranel nodded. He glanced past the man to the corridor and measured. The corridor led away from the canal, back toward the plaza. He could not go that way and carry what he carried. He shifted his grip on the flute as if to test again, then lowered it and let his right hand drop to the case's strap. The mirror silver inside held the prism as steady as a thought held between 2 sentences. Of course, Aranel said. Thank you for your patience. He moved to pass the steward. The steward moved to block and failed by a breath. Aranel did not touch him. He altered his path by an inch, and the man's body chose to pivot rather than collide. It was an old habit of civilized people to avoid small embarrassments. Aranel relied on that habit now the way a hunter relies on wind. He slipped into the hall and followed it 3 steps, then took the service stair that vanished to the right. The steward was still turning to ask whether he had seen the oil can on the second shelf, when Aranel had already dropped out of sight. The stair tightened and twisted. The air took on a smell of stone that had held water and then been scorched dry. He descended until the light dwindled. At the bottom, a narrow door waited, its surface scored with wear that someone had sanded down and repainted more than once. He pressed his palm against the center and pushed. The door resisted and then gave, opening onto a long arcade where pillars marched toward a low gate open to the night. He walked. Outside, the plain lay quiet, and the stars looked nearer than they had above the city. A line of low huts formed a broken row near the outer wall. Maintenance, watchmen, vendors who slept where their goods slept. Aranel crossed the ground between shadow and shadow until he reached the last hut and knelt in its lee. He set the flute across his knees and unbuttoned the case. The mirror silver gleamed. The prism hovered above it like a heart that had not decided which body to choose. He took a breath that made his chest ache, and then another. He slid the cloth aside and whispered to the shard. He did not know whether it could hear, but he had learned to speak to dangerous things as if they were listening. "You do not belong to a cage," he said. "You belong to the place where motion learns its own shape." He moved the mirror silver and lowered the prism into the lined hollow meant for it. The cloth folded over like a petal. The petal closed. He stood and looked once at the city. The dome's glow had sharpened. Lines of crimson and amethyst moved through the streets in patrols that intersected without ever touching. The festival music still sounded, but the notes had lost their ease. The city was correcting. It would correct all night. Aranel turned his back to it and began to walk. He did not run. He did not look over his shoulder. He kept to the low ground where the wind laid frost in narrow tongues. He held the case under his cloak and let his feet remember 1,000 paths where no map could follow. The wilds were far. The wilds were close. He would not stop. Before the land dipped out of sight of the wall, he paused and spoke again to those who would not hear him yet and would need to hear him soon. "Move while there is light," he said. "Move even when there is not. Take your young and your old. Leave your trophies. Keep your names. Keep your songs. I will open a way." The night took his words and set them traveling. He listened until his breathing steadied. Then he went down into the dark, and the city behind him tightened its jaw around an absence it could not name. Part 2. The Festival of Radiant Law. The dawn above Eruhal's crown came without warmth. A pale gradient rippled across the glass dome, mimicking a sunrise that did not exist. The light did not grow. It only brightened with mathematical accuracy until the streets gleamed as if carved from frozen time. The city's central terraces filled with sound, bells of perfect pitch, synchronized to resonate through the ley lines that fed the architect's network. Each ring of sound was identical to the last. Each echo was sterile. Aranel had slept no more than a breath since taking the prism. He rested in a forgotten servant's hallway that slanted beneath the lower bridges, where a drip of condensation gathered into shallow pools. His hands trembled faintly from the weight of the artifact hidden within the double-lined flute case. He did not open it. He had learned the hard lesson of relics. Some things answered when looked at too long. When the first ceremonial horn sounded, he rose, splashed his face with the cold water at the wall's edge, and replaced the hood that marked him as one of the city's musicians. Today the celebration reached its height. The Festival of Radiant Law was the architect's favored expression of dominance, a display of order so absolute that even emotion was choreographed. It was also Aranel's path through the crowds and toward his exit. The procession of perfection. The upper streets were crowded by noon. White and blue streamers hung in arcs across the grand avenue, trembling slightly from the constant pulse of ley energy that kept the city alive. Children in narrow masks recited verses of gratitude for symmetry. The scent of fruit, too perfect to be real, drifted from crystal trays that floated beside merchant booths. Every color gleamed with artificial clarity. Aranel joined the second line of performers, his flute visible and his smile practiced. Around him, dancers swirled in measured circles, their steps rehearsed for weeks to please the silent watchers who observed from the high balconies. Behind those balconies, the architect's fragments whispered through mirrored relays, watching, judging, adjusting. When the drums began, Aranel's body fell into rhythm without hesitation. His motions were smooth, but his mind ran ahead of the music. He counted guard rotations along the causeways, the intervals between each ley surge, and the pattern of watchtowers lighting in sequence. He memorized all of it the way another man might memorize a prayer. He caught sight of one officer among the crowd, a Chaos Legion captain draped in dark violet cloth and plated gold. The man's prismatic red eyes gleamed whenever his head turned. Behind him, 2 hollow sentinels stood motionless. Their faceless bodies reflected the captain's pride in endless repetition. Aranel lowered his head, letting the hood shade his expression. Everything the architect touches reflects itself, he thought. Even arrogance repeats. Second, the dance of obedience. At the heart of the plaza, a raised stage of glass had been prepared for the performance known as the Dance of Obedience. It was a slow ballet depicting the birth of order from the chaos of the severing. The irony did not escape Aranel. He ascended the stage among other performers. Each wore white garments that glowed faintly under ley illumination. At the conductor's nod, they began to move in perfect sequence. Their shadows fell on the glass beneath their feet like threads in a tapestry. Aranel's movements were liquid. To the audience, he was only another dancer within the designed perfection, but every gesture masked a deeper purpose. With each turn and leap, he positioned himself closer to the structural seams that supported the stage. His awareness was surgical, listening to vibrations beneath the glass, reading the hum of the ley line that ran below the plaza. The conductor's baton lifted for the climax. Aranel extended his arm, spun once, and brushed his fingers against the glass just as the ley pulse struck. A faint vibration ran up his wrist. The surge had weakened. The absence of the prism was beginning to unbalance the current. He smiled inwardly. The city was already sick and did not know it yet. When the performance ended, the audience applauded in unison. Even the sound of their palms meeting followed the same rhythm. Aranel bowed and stepped down with the others, vanishing into the mass of attendants who swarmed to clear the stage for the next display. Third, the Banquet of Light. Inside the Dome of Harmony, nobles gathered under hanging orbs that imitated sunlight. Tables of translucent stone curved in half circles around the central podium where speeches would soon begin. Every dish shimmered as though carved from color itself. The air carried the hum of the ley lines embedded in the walls. Aranel entered quietly among the serving musicians, adjusting his hood so only the lower half of his face was visible. He played soft background measures, gentle arpeggios meant to fill silence between toasts. The music hid the sound of his steps as he drifted closer to the center. He listened, pretending not to listen. At the high table, a noble in golden filigree leaned toward a legion captain. They say the vault below the light has never been breached. The prism hums brighter every year. The captain laughed, a hard metallic sound. Nothing touches it. The lay cage obeys the architect's law. Not even he himself could steal from himself. Aranel's lips curved faintly around the flute. Not even he himself. He repeated in thought. He wondered what the captain would say if he knew the relic was already gone. He turned away before his expression could betray satisfaction. His eyes met a servant's across the room, a young woman carrying a tray of silver goblets. She gave the smallest of nods, a movement that might have meant nothing to anyone else. Aranel recognized it. Fae allies had long ago adopted the habit of speaking through minimal gestures when trapped in hostile courts. He caught her near a column while adjusting his cloak. "South Vent," she whispered as she passed. 2 hours. He inclined his head in acknowledgement and resumed playing. The note that followed trembled slightly, more from anticipation than fear. 4th. The Architect's Sermon. The dome dimmed. A deep tone rose from the crystal foundation beneath them. The nobles turned toward the central dais where a sphere of light grew until it filled the air above the platform. A voice emerged, not spoken, but printed directly into the minds of those gathered. "Praise the symmetry. Praise the design. The world remains because the law remains." It was not the architect himself, but a projection of his consciousness, a fragment of awareness that scanned the gathering for disorder. Aranel kept his breathing even. He felt the voice like cold fingers tracing the edges of his mind, searching for deviation. He thought of the wilds. He thought of Heath, standing unflinching before beings stronger than gods, and of Lythra, who believed motion itself could be holy. He anchored himself in those memories and let the architect's attention slide over him. The voice continued. "Imperfection has been measured and contained. Chaos reduced. The pattern endures. Applause followed. Mechanical and complete." Aranel's stomach turned. There was beauty in order, but not in cages that called themselves peace. As the light sphere dimmed, he exhaled quietly. The prism's absence had not yet been discovered, but the ley trembled. The city's perfection was cracking beneath the surface. Flicker in the glass. The feast continued. Musicians alternated their positions. Aranel drifted between groups, playing short pieces as he moved. He kept his awareness stretched thin, listening not to the crowd, but to the vibrations through the floor. Then it happened, a pulse so strong it rattled the chandeliers. The air shimmered. For one instant the mirrored walls of the dome reflected the city not as it was, but as it could be. Warped, incomplete, streaked with flickers of black energy. The prism's theft had reached the network. A murmur spread through the room. Nobles glanced upward, confused, but not yet afraid. Guards shifted. Someone whispered a prayer to the architect. Aranel used the confusion to slip past a pair of stewards guarding a side hallway. He walked quickly, head down, posture calm. The corridor beyond was narrow, lined with reflective panels that hummed softly as the ley currents surged. His fingers brushed the flute case under his cloak, reassuring himself the artifact was still sealed and silent. He turned a corner and stopped as the hum rose to a painful pitch. For a heartbeat, he felt something brush across his thoughts, a searching presence, ancient and mathematical. The architect was looking. Aranel closed his eyes and whispered under his breath, "You cannot hear rhythm, old god. You only count." The presence withdrew, unsatisfied. 6. The hollow feast. When he returned to the dome, the chaos had already subsided. The architect's voice had soothed the crowd through unseen channels. Servants moved swiftly to replace broken glassware and shattered ornaments. Aranel resumed his place among the musicians. The conductor raised a hand, and a slow melody began, a reconstruction of calm. He looked across the banquet once more. A servant near the edge of the platform dropped a chalice. It shattered, silver and glass scattering across the floor. Before anyone could react, The pieces lifted and reassembled themselves, reforming into a perfect whole. The servant stared in horror at her own hands. The room applauded the miracle. Aranel did not. He lowered his flute, letting silence fill his lungs. Even ruin must obey, he thought. What happens when the prism no longer obeys? When the final toast ended, he slipped through a side exit and descended the maintenance stair that spiraled below the banquet halls. The air grew cooler, thick with the metallic scent of ley energy. The hum beneath his feet deepened into something closer to a heartbeat. He followed the sound until the stairs opened into a shadowed corridor leading toward the lowest levels of Eruhal's crown. There, the vault waited, a chamber known to few, feared by many. Aranel adjusted his cloak and began to descend. Part 3. The vault below the light. The descent below harmony. The maintenance stair curled downward like a rib cage. The stones were pale and fine-grained, each block shaved to a perfect fit, each seam brushed with a mineral that caught and held a thin coastal sheen. As Aranel descended, the light thinned to a wash of cold blue that seemed to pour out of the steps themselves. The air grew heavy with a metallic scent, part rain on iron, part crushed quartz. It tasted clean at first, then too clean, like water stripped of everything that made it river. On the landing below, a narrow hallway stretched into the city's bones. Veins of ley light ran inside the walls, constant as breath, bright at regular intervals, dark where junctions spread the current in a lattice. Small inspection plates glimmered between the veins, labeled with tiny glyphs that changed their order whenever he blinked. A slow, low hum rolled inside the stone. It had the steadiness of a heart, yet it never varied, not even to rest. The architect preferred constancy to life. Aranel moved with care. Each footfall was deliberate, heel to midfoot to toe. He let his breathing settle into the hum until his ribs matched the city's rhythm. The double-lined case lay under his cloak against his ribs. Within, the mirror-silver cradle held the prism without touch. He did not open it. He would not open it. He pictured Lethra's hands tying a fae knot that turned a thread into a seal, and he let that memory stand where fear wanted to stand. A whisper brushed the edge of his hearing. Not sound, but pressure against thought. Words formed inside the pressure with a calm that had no throat. Praise the symmetry. Announce deviations. The voice slid along the smooth walls and seemed to speak from everywhere and nowhere. Aranel kept his gaze forward. He answered in his head as if to a tutor who had made a mistake. I will praise grace. I will announce nothing. The hallway opened without a door. A ring of tiles marked the threshold, each tile cut with a mask. The masks had no eyes, only smooth ovals where sight should be. Aranel stepped over them, choosing the spaces between. He entered a chamber as tall as the dome above the city, yet buried far below it. The ceiling vanished into a fog of light. The floor did not exist in any sensible way. Cubes of pale crystal hung in the air at different heights, rotating slowly, each face carved with channels that carried thin lines of ley light. Between the cubes, open space waited. The cubes were not still. They drifted and clicked together, then parted, then advanced along invisible paths. When two touched, a bridge of light grew between them and held until a measure passed, then faded as if it had never been there. Second, the Chamber of Sequences. A staircase stood to his right, narrow and without railing. It rose to a hovering cube that carried the first of the light bridges. Aranel placed one hand against the stone pillar that supported the stair and listened. Beneath the hum, a second rhythm moved, faster and broken, a ledger of the cube positions expressed in tone. He pulled his flute free and let it rest under his chin without raising it to his lip. He tapped a 3-note figure on the wood with his thumbnail. The cubes paused for the smallest fraction of time. The bridges brightened by a breath. Then the pattern resumed with a slight delay that he recorded in his body, not as numbers, but as length and return. He climbed, steady and light. The first cube drifted toward him and offered a face like a doorframe. A bridge grew from the edge, a plank of translucent radiance. The beam had no texture, yet his foot found friction upon it. He crossed to the second cube as a third swung near, and he placed his weight on the far edge at the exact moment the first bridge winked away. 2 steps later, he was suspended over a fall so long that no echo returned to mark the drop. The sequence expected an obedient walker who had no reason to hesitate. The sequence was written to the Prism's pulse. That pulse was missing now, and the error whispered around the chamber like a draft. Twice the cubes met a breath too late. Twice the bridges reached his toes as if deciding whether to exist. He moved anyway. Doubt belonged to people who waited for certainty. He carried enough of his own. A cube ahead shuddered. A thread of darkness ran through its channels like ink in clear water. The bridge that should have formed between it and its neighbor bent into a curve and tried to attach to a point that did not exist. The 2 faces scraped, ringing in a pitch that drilled through his skull. The bridge failed. The gap ahead was longer than a man could jump. Aranel stopped. His weight rested on a beam no wider than his palm. The void felt like winter on his skin. He lowered the flute and blew one soft note. The note climbed, turned on itself, and returned, thinner, as if the chamber had shaved it. He held the returning pitch at his teeth and walked it against a second tone, imagined rather than heard. Where the 2 met, a small beat formed, a tremor that rose and fell while he shifted his stance. The faulty cube trembled in sympathy. Its channels brightened, then steadied. The bridge sprouted like frost between the faces and held. He crossed. The beam dissolved behind him. The cubes moved with new caution, almost as if listening. He moved with them, letting the measure live in his knees and ankles, and he reached the far side with the slow exhale of a tightrope walker stepping onto sod. A narrow ledge ran along the wall. It carried him past a bank of instruments behind crystal. Pistons slid within them without ever touching. Gears turned that had no teeth. Lines of numbers crawled in pale script across a plate, then drifted apart and condensed again into different lines. At the center, a black sphere no larger than a fist hung inside a hoop of glass. The hoop rotated. The sphere did not. When the rotation aligned with some distant pulse, a shiver passed through the wall and ran ahead like a ripple through tall grass. The city felt wrong. The city knew it felt wrong, and still it insisted on rightness. Third, the Vault Guardians. The ledge turned a corner and delivered him into a low passage framed by 2 statues. At first he thought they were carved stone. Then they breathed. Hollow sentinels waited, one on each side of the next arch. Their bodies were woven from hair-thin filaments of metal, each filament lit by a traveling spark. Tonight the sparks stuttered and broke, as if the current that fed them had missed a step. A faint whine ran through their frames, high and pained. Aranel lowered his center of gravity. He let his shoulders relax and his fingers go quiet. He was an elf who had learned the wilds, and he had given his bones to motion for so long that stillness could become a blade when he needed it. He set the flute case gently against the wall and eased the curved blade from its sheath. The blade drank light and gave back a sheen like water in a cave. Verin's grace lay hidden along his forearm, a short dagger with a plain hilt, and a temper that knew how to part light from itself. He stepped as if he meant to pass between the sentinels without noticing them. At 2 paces, their heads tilted. The masks that passed for faces turned toward him, then toward the case, then back to him. The left sentinel raised its staff. Lines of violet kindled along the shaft and bent into rings that rotated around the head. "Inspection," Aranel said, and he let mild annoyance lift his tone. "The conductor sent me. The harmonic fault is climbing." The right sentinel took a half step. The rings along its staff brightened. Their pressure stroked the skin of his chest like a giant hand that wanted to flatten a wrinkle. The left sentinel opened its free palm. Within the mesh of its fingers, a coin of ley light appeared, a pass token that would have carried any obedient worker through. The coin flickered and went out. The sentinel considered the failure for a breath longer than a machine should have needed. Its head tilted farther, almost human in confusion. Aranel moved. He slid inside the circle of the left staff and let his shoulder brush the woven ribs where an arm would meet a body. The staff attempted to swing. His blade caught the shaft an inch from his skull and ran up it with a soft chime. He turned his wrist and met the sentinel's neck with the flat of the sword. The mesh tightened under the strike. He felt the resistance of woven metal that did not want to yield. Verin's grace kissed the seam behind the sentinel's jaw with a motion that contained no anger at all. The mesh opened like a curtain. Light bled out in a blue sigh. The sentinel's body softened, then folded onto one knee, then lay down as if accepting sleep at last. The second sentinel lunged. The staff carved a cone through the air and swept arcs of prismatic light toward his legs. The floor beneath his boots lost its sense of up. He stepped anyway. He let gravity become a suggestion and placed his weight on an angle that offered friction. The staff came back toward his ribs. He bent. The strike passed. The edge of the shaft clipped his cloak and made it snap. He entered the sentinel's reach where the staff could not recover in time. It tried to trap him with its free hand. Aranel pivoted under the mesh fingers and brought Verin's grace across the inside of the wrist where the strands were densest. The dagger did not soar. It parted what it touched the way dawn parts fog. The sentinel spasmed. Its hand went slack. He brought the curved blade down through the lattice over its chest and felt the faint give where the binding threads joined. 2 short motions and the core lines separated. The sentinel sagged. Its light dimmed as if sinking through deep water. He stepped back to keep his boots clear, not for cleanliness, but to avoid the cooling strands that could snare an ankle. He watched both still figures for a count of 30. He bowed his head for 1 heartbeat. "You obeyed. You did not choose." There was no triumph in the words, only recognition. He retrieved the case and moved through the arch before the chamber could change its mind. 4. The ley pulse. Beyond, the vault's outer corridor breathed in long, shallow pools. The walls were not flat. They swelled and narrowed in a slow rhythm, ribs exhaling against his shoulders as he passed. Each swell released a faint snowfall of a glass dust that caught the light in tiny glints. The floor was smoother than ice, yet his boots held. The current below his feet ran so close to the surface that his arches ached with it. The hum deepened. It became a tone that lifted the skin along his arms. Hair rose on his forearms as if at storm's edge. Ahead, the passage widened into a rotunda with a bowl-shaped floor. The bowl was black glass, veined with threads that grew brighter as he approached the center. The brightness climbed his calves, and the muscles of his thighs thrummed in reply. The air smelled like struck stone. A pressure gathered in his ears. The vault convulsed. Light blew from the seams in the floor in white spears and then collapsed into grey. The far wall swam, retreated, and returned to its place. The ceiling breathed inward until it looked low enough to touch, then rose with a groan. He staggered and planted 1 hand on the floor. The glass was hot. The case thumped against his ribs. He pressed it to his chest. He spoke quietly, as if the wilds had laid their ear to the ground. "Hold your ground. I am still moving." He did not know whether any fey ear could hear him through this maze of law and stone, but the words steadied his own breath, and that was enough. The pulse passed. The bowl steadied. In the wake of the convulsion, small fissures traced out across the black glass like frost. Through the cracks he saw depth that did not belong to any room this size. He saw something vast, a diagram with living lines, a network that spread beneath the city like roots under a grove. The network flickered. Parts of it were going dark, then lighting, then dark again, not in patterns that made sense, but in spasms. He moved to the far side before the next spasm, and the corridor opened into a hall made of mirrors. The mirror corridor. At first he thought it was glass that faced him on both sides, carved in sheets so polished that even darkness looked bright upon them. Then he saw that the mirrors did not reflect him alone. They reflected versions. Aranel in a cloak torn at the shoulder, Aranel with blood at the chin, Aranel holding the flute, the case missing, Aranel walking in step with a woman whose hair was a crown of silver thorns, Aranel slower, older still. He stopped and lifted his hand. The reflections lifted their hands. Two did not. The one with the blood at the chin lowered his palm and shook his head in pity. The one without the case stared at the floor as if it could still be there if he refused to see. The corridor narrowed. The mirrors leaned inward like tall reeds in wind. His breath fogged the surface closest to his shoulder. In that fog, a message wrote itself in ragged script. "Turn back, thief!" The words did not move the way letters move. They expanded like cracks. The fog cleared, and the letters did not exist anymore, yet the warning continued as a feeling under his ribs. He spoke aloud, calm and clear. "I am not a god. I am not a law. I am a man who chose to act." He let the truth of that set his weight. He picked a single reflection, the one where he held the case, and his eyes looked forward without flinching. He walked that line and let the others drift like fish in a river he did not plan to catch. Halfway through, the floor slanted without warning. The mirrors on the left slid closer. Their frames scraped the floor with a noise like broken shells. He quickened his step. The faces in the glass blurred. Some of them laughed. One cried out as if stabbed. He did not look. He reached the final pane and touched it with 2 fingers. The glass felt like a pool. It gave. He stepped through. Cold wrapped his knees and then his thighs. He pushed forward a pace and came out on the other side into darkness pricked with far lights. 6. The escape beneath light. A low passage opened into a long shaft. The shaft tilted upward, then bent, then leveled and ran away into what might have been night, or might have been a painted illusion meant to reassure workers that outside still existed. An outflow pipe half his height ran beside it, full of water so clear that its surface cut the darkness like a blade. The shaft's mouth stood under a grill that opened to the plain beyond Eruhal's crown. Through the grill, distant stars rested on a strip of sky the color of slate. Between him and that thin freedom, a barrier slept in the arch. It was not metal. It was not glass. It was a surface like oil across the mouth of a bottle. It would close from a thought, and it would not care if bones were inside it when it did. Aranel set the case down and drew the mirror silver shard. The shard remembered the cage, and how to turn touch into not touch. He angled it until the surface revealed the barrier's sheen. The barrier did not reflect the room behind him. It reflected a different space, a copy of the shaft with no man in it. He slid the reflection of his hand along the shard until it reached the reflection of the barrier, and then he pushed. The mirror passed into the copy. The barrier flexed as if pressed by an invisible finger. The city felt him then. Not the guards running above, not the stewards counting faults, the city itself. The hum rose, the shaft vibrated. Dust sifted from the ceiling in a slow drift that glittered as it fell. The barrier began to seal. Aranel moved. He shouldered the case, turned sideways to slip through the narrowest space a man could fit, and let the mirror show him a gap that did not yet exist. He stepped where the gap would be. The barrier closed against his back with a pressure that pressed the air from his lungs. He kept going. His shoulder scraped the frame. The case rattled, then steadied as he hugged it tighter. His boot caught on a raised lip. He brought his foot down and felt grass under his sole. He fell forward into the shallow ditch beyond the wall and rolled once to keep the case safe. He came to rest with his face in dry weeds that smelled like dust and old sunlight. The hum behind him dwindled by degrees once the barrier sealed. The grill above his head framed a ribbon of night. He pushed himself to his knees and crouched among the weeds. No shout came, no horn. The city was still busy correcting inside its perfection. He lifted the case and held it a moment against his chest. The weight felt no heavier and no lighter. It felt like a promise under a mountain that does not know it will move. Move while there is light, he whispered to the wilds and to anyone else who might listen. Move even when there is not. Take your young and your old. Leave your trophies. Keep your names. Keep your songs. I am coming. He kept low and ran the ditch line until the ground dipped and the city's outer lights slipped behind a ridge. The plain opened. Tall winter grass bowed and rose. Pools the size of shields reflected a cold sky. He crossed the first field and the second. His breath made small ghosts that the wind pulled apart. He did not look back. Far to the south, a faint shimmer marked the line where the Faye wilds began to throw their light against the horizon. The shimmer lifted his heart. It also warned him. The architect would see that light. The architect would send more than sentinels the next time. He settled into a loping pace that he could hold until dawn. The case lay warm under his cloak. With each step the memory of the vault dimmed, yet the taste of the ley-light remained on his tongue, bright as metal, clean as nothing. He swallowed against it and let the night give him its older flavors, soil and frost and wind. Somewhere behind him, deep under stone and symmetry, the chamber of cubes miscounted its first measure. A bridge grew to the wrong length and fell. The impact rang through the levels and chipped a sliver from a polished face. The sliver skittered to a halt by a drain and waited for a sweep that did not come. The city continued to hum as if nothing had happened. Aranel did not slow. He carried the wrongness into open land because that was the only way to teach a cage how to open. He fixed his mind on the forest's first silver trunks and on the faces that would meet him there. He planned his words not to impress, but to keep hearts steady. "We walk together," he would say. "We look for one another. We spend nothing the enemy wants us to spend. We live today so we can fight tomorrow." He moved through the grass until the grass gave way to fieldstone, and the fieldstone to the first low rise of a land that remembered how to bend without breaking. The sky paled along its eastern edge. The night pulled its coverlet away from the plain. He had not slept, yet his steps did not falter. The wilds were ahead. The chase would come. Between those two facts, there was only one choice left to make, again and again, until the end. He kept moving. Chapter 2. The War in the Wilds. Part 1. Return to the Faye Wilds. The shattered boundary. The plain did not end so much as fold upward into trees. From a distance, the Faye Wilds looked like a sea of silver trunks, drifting under low clouds. But as Aranel drew near, he saw that the clouds were not clouds at all. They were slow rivers of ley-light that had slipped their channels and now wandered between the crowns of the oldest oaks. Each river gave off a soft crackle, like silk torn under water. The air tasted sweet and metallic. The grass underfoot bowed and lifted, as if a tide moved through the soil. He paused at the boundary where meadow became root and shadow. The trees stood close, bark braided with pale vines that pulsed like veins. Leaves showed two faces at once, green on one side and mirror bright on the other. At every breath, 1,000 reflections turned to study him. When the wind came, it did not blow from one direction. It arrived from many places at once, then went still, as if the forest had decided to listen. Aranel stepped in and felt the wilds recognize him. Low branches eased aside. A living path unwound, its edges marked by foxflowers that glowed with soft white hearts. He moved quickly, yet the forest moved quicker. Roots slid under earth to lift his ankles over snags. Thorny vines fell slack as he passed, then tightened behind him. The case lay under his cloak, where his ribs could feel its shape. Within the double lining, the mirror-silver cradle held the prism just out of touch, a dark weight that turned the air around it too clear to trust. Ahead, the ley light thickened and fell in slow sheets. The ground rose into a ridge of red stone, veined with quartz. Gravity hesitated on the ridge, then resumed as if embarrassed. Aranel crossed while the hesitation held, boots finding purchase where others would have slid. When he crested the ridge, the wilds opened into a shallow basin, where ancient beeches stood like pillars of dusk. Their roots braided across the basin's floor to form natural ramparts. Between those roots he saw movement that was not forest. Fair scouts crouched in the gloom, faces lit by the dim lamps they carried within cupped leaves. Every eye he met had the look of a runner who has turned one more time than he thought he could. Armor of woven bark and silver thorn lay cracked on more than a few shoulders. Bows strung with hair, thin threads lay ready. When they saw Aranel, hands tightened on bow grips, then loosened as they recognized his stride. One rose from a knot of roots near the basin's center. Lythra of the silver thorns wore a corselet that had grown from living vines. It fitted her like memory. Silver leaves ringed her temples, not crown and not ornament, but a sign that the forest had decided to keep her words. Her eyes took in Aranel in one sweep, noting the dust, the set of his jaw, the small ways a body betrays its night. Relief did not soften her face. It sharpened it, as if her mind had been waiting for one piece to settle before she could lift another. "You are back," she said. "The ground hums wrong. Tell me you did not come with empty hands." "I did not come with empty hands," Aranel said. He kept his voice low, so the forest would carry it where it needed to go. "Eruhal's crown is missing its heart. The prism is not there." Lythra's gaze slid to the case. She did not ask to see. She only nodded once, the motion small and grave. "We feel the absence. It burns us as it cools them. The ley has begun to wander. The Legion will not let that stand." "They will arrive soon," Aranel said. He looked past her into the basin's dark. "How many?" "Too few," Lythra said. "Enough to be the first to die if we choose the wrong ground." She turned and lifted 2 fingers. The basin rustled. Runners came from shadow, their armor wet with dew and sap. A drummer with a shallow drum stood at the lip of the rampart and struck a quiet pattern that rippled through the roots like a pulse. Aranel raised his voice so it reached the edges of the basin. "Listen to me. We are not a wall. We are a rhythm. Move in pairs and in small bands. Watch one another. Do not stand where the air looks too smooth. That air belongs to them." He touched the case. "I carry a thing the architect wants. He will spend bodies to reach it. Do not spend yours to pay that price. Spend the ground. Spend the light. Keep your names." The wilds shifted. The leaves above them turned and offered their mirror faces to the ridge. In those mirrors, the sky over the plain showed a new color. It was bruise-colored, purple shading into red, with a bright seam at its center. The seam opened. Second, arrival at the edge grove. They reached the edge grove as the seam widened. The grove had been beautiful once, a ring of elder ash trees around a spring clear enough to shame mirrors. Now the ash crowns fanned into spirals that leaned away from the seam, and the spring had climbed its own banks. Water stood in the air like a curved wall and made ripples without falling. The ground tilted toward the seam, then flattened, then tilted again, as if measuring whether to kneel. Lythra climbed one of the lower roots and stood where her voice would carry. Band Sun and Maya hold the left. Bands Thorn and Reed hold the right. Runners cut the flanks and return. No one breaks from the lines unless called. You do not chase. You do not gather trophies. You only live. Aranel stepped beside her on the route. The seam trembled, then split like cloth cut by invisible shears. Through the cut, a rectangle of not sky appeared. It showed polished stone, carefully placed banners, the corner of a balcony. The rectangle widened and turned, and as it turned, a platform of glass slid into the grove, as if a hand had pushed it from the other side. On that platform stood the first rank of the Chaos Legion. Their eyes were red and purple, both colors moving in prismatic bands like storms trapped behind glass. They wore mail that was more geometry than metal, plates set at angles that turned light back on itself. Some carried halberds that breathed frost. Some carried staves capped with shapes that refused to settle into one form. Between the lines floated mirror plates that had been given purpose. The plates tilted, and the grove's reflections in them fell inward as if called. Aranel drew his curved blade. He did not speak to the Legion. He spoke to the Fae who would stand where he stood if he fell. "Watch the hands," he called, "not the eyes. They cast through shape. When the right hand closes, the ground will try to become sky. When the left hand opens, close your own, or the light will enter and steal where you look." Lythra smiled without kindness. "You are still a teacher when you should be a ghost." "Ghosts are for later," Aranel said. "Today is for breath." The Legion moved first. Red and purple woke in their eyes and focused into needle-bright points. 2 ranks lifted their staves. The air thickened until it looked like glass about to give. A captain at the front carved a sign with 3 fingers and drew a line across the space with his palm. Gravity obeyed the sign. The spring that had climbed its banks flexed sideways and became a wall that rolled across the grove like clear thunder. "Down," Aranel said, and his voice entered the pattern of the drum. The drum answered with a low triplet. The Fae dropped behind the braided roots as the water wall passed. It carried leaves, twigs, and one stray blade that had not dipped fast enough. The blade hit a tree with the speed of a falling star and sank to its hilt. Sap steamed. The tree shuddered and grew a knot around the wound. Other captains spread their fingers. Lines of violet fire braided into ropes, then snapped forward in arcs that sought eyes and mouths. Lythra flung out her arm. Vines rose like snakes and caught the ropes in mid-air. The ropes burned the vines black, but the black fall fed the roots, and new green replaced it before the ropes reached any faces. Aranel moved through the first rain of spells the way a dancer moves through silk curtains. He did not hurry. Hurrying belonged to fear, and fear took vision away. 2 halberdiers advanced on his left, their prismatic eyes bright as a storm. He let them see him. He showed them a target, then offered 3 more. Illusions peeled from his shoulders like sheets of light. The first halberd bit a copy and left nothing. The second found an echo and struck wood. The true Aranel slid inside the second man's reach, turned the halberd with one wrist, and cut the strap that held the shoulder plate with the other. Metal slid and caught. The man stumbled. Aranel stepped through the gap, his curved blade lifted at waist height. The edge met underarm mesh and went quiet. The body folded as if kneeling. The partner pivoted and sent a fan of crystal shards in a wide sweep. Aranel lowered his head and felt the crystals part his hair. He closed with the man, set his palm at the base of the halberd where it pinched into the haft, and shoved. The motion did not need strength. It needed angle. The weapon bit the ground. The legionnaire looked down for a fraction. Verin's grace kissed the unarmored throat above the gorget. The kiss was small and final. He did not look back to see them fall. The edgegrove turned bright, then brighter. Lances of red light cut the air. Where they passed, bark flashed to glass. A rank of mirror plates tilted and poured a rain of cold fire over the roots. The fire did not climb downward. It climbed where eyes looked. 3 Fae froze for a breath because the sight was wrong. Aranel saw the hesitation from the corner of his eye. He shouted to them while his blade worked. "Look to your hands," he called. "Not to the sky. Grip the bow. See the string. See your friend. The fire follows your gaze." They dropped their eyes. The cold fire climbed into empty air and spread itself thin like milk in water, then vanished. One of the 3 laughed once, the sound clipped and wild, as if she had been held under and had found air. The forest woke in answer to the invasion. Lethra stepped down from the root and sang a note that had no words, only shape. The ash trees leaned. Their leaves turned all at once to mirror. They showed the legion to themselves. For a heartbeat, red and purple eyes saw their own faces multiplied 1,000 times. The mirror plates shuddered. Spells lost focus. The ash roots rose. Spears grew where no wood had been a moment before. The spears did not fly. They unfolded in a line and pushed. Legion shields turned aside half. The other half found joints and gaps, and the places where geometry had assumed the wrong angle. A captain clenched a fist. The ground answered with a ring of force that ran outward from his heel. Where it passed, vines lost their will and fell limp. Lithra's song changed, and the limpness passed like a fever that breaks when the body decides to live. Another captain spread his hands and drew in air. The reflection of the ash grove in a mirror plate tore free and became a second grove upside down above the first. The inverted trees began to fall. Aranel counted steps, closed his eyes against the visual lie, and ran the pattern on memory. He called to the band on the right. "Arrows to the places you cannot see. Shoot on trust. Count 6 and shoot again. Your brothers are moving through the numbers." They obeyed. The first arrows passed through the phantom grove and found a ladder of staves that had been hidden behind it. The second arrows found faces lifted to speak a word that would have made the air into a knife. The word died unborn. Third, the Chaos Legion attack. The seam widened until it became a gate as broad as the basin. More platforms slid through, each bearing a contingent of legionnaires whose prismatic eyes glowed like lamps. Behind the infantry, casters in deep violet mantles raised both arms and began a chant that had nothing to do with sound. Shapes formed in front of them, circles within squares within triangles that refused to sit still. The circles spun, and the triangles climbed in and out of the squares like fish refusing nets. At the outer edges of those figures, sparks appeared and began to join. When the casters dropped their arms, the joined sparks became storms. Crystal hail roared from the first storm, hard as iron and sharp as knives. Stones split where it fell. Leaves turned to silver dust. A second storm dumped black water that soaked everything, and then decided to burn. The fire clung to wet bark and drank it. The third storm was a place where sound could not cross. Fae who stepped inside it moved like figures in a nightmare. Their mouths opened and closed. No calls reached them. Bows turned to toys. Aranel ran toward the third storm, because it was the one that cut the rhythm. He entered at a low angle, head turned so one eye kept a sliver of outside. The world inside the storm looked washed and slow. His feet felt as if they had chosen the wrong day to forgive him. He set his palm against his chest, felt the case, and let his heartbeat give him a count. 1, 2, 3, 4. He moved on 4 and changed direction on 1. He reached a band of 3 Fae who were fighting on courage alone and touched the first at the elbow. "Follow my shoulders," he said, and though the storm ate his words, the rhythm arrived through his body. He took 2 steps, dipped left, rose, and pushed with his forearm. The 3 moved as one. Together they crossed the edge. Sound returned like a shout from a cliff. The 3 looked at each other and began to laugh, that same clipped laugh that means the world is not finished yet. Spells slammed the grove in waves. A halberdier with eyes like a wine-dark sky swung for Aranel's hip. Aranel planted the ball of his foot and let the force carry the halberd past, while his other foot traced a crescent behind him. He chopped at the weapon's hinge and then spun the back edge up into the legionnaire's wrist. Fingers opened. The halberd fell. Verin's grace found the hand that reached to catch it. The hand closed on nothing and did not open again. He found time to speak while blades worked. "Keep breathing. Do not chase. Step to the rhythm you trust. If you break the shape, we lose the shape." On the left, a caster made a cutting gesture. The spring answered with a vertical column of water that froze in a lattice as it rose. The lattice thickened into a cage of blue ice around 6 Fae who had given ground in the wrong direction. Lythra stabbed her palm toward the sky. Vines erupted around the ice cage and squeezed. The cage cracked, shattered, and fell in slow sheets that rang like bells when they struck the root ramparts. A new figure stepped onto the forward platform. He wore no mantle. His armor had been polished until it showed a faint reflection of the world. His eyes were red and purple, but the colors did not move. They stared, fixed and cold. He lifted one bare hand and closed his fingers until only the index remained. He pointed at Aranel from across the grove and drew a line in the air. Pain answered. It did not come from any wound. It came from the space around him. The world tried to decide that Aranel should not be where he was. The ground beneath his boots shifted half a pace to the left. The air took the half pace to the right. His bones debated which to join. He staggered. The line of the finger drew closer. Aranel stepped into a motion he had saved for the rarest pressure. He did not meet the line. He did not avoid it. He moved through a space that could not decide what it was. To the watcher he seemed to blur without fading. The finger line passed. It struck a root behind him. The root leaped. Bark exploded into glass petals that swung on invisible strings. The petals sang as they cut the air. Aranel pointed his blade at the caster and lifted his chin. He did not smile. He did not challenge. He only looked. And in the looking he promised things that had nothing to do with pride. The caster gestured both hands and spoke a word that arrived as a taste. Iron, salt, old smoke. A triangle formed, then broke, then formed again. The ground directly beneath Aranel shimmered like hot stone. He shifted 2 fingers on his grip and closed the distance with 3 short steps. The caster had not expected anyone to advance through that word. Surprise peeled the red and purple back from his eyes for the smallest of moments. In that moment, Aranel saw a human glance through the glass. "Go home when they let you," Aranel said, and then he ran forward under a sheet of shards that tried to become a wall. He turned his shoulder and let the shards pass behind him, not by speed alone, but by arriving where they were late. Verin's grace flashed once at the caster's hip, slicing the thin braid that anchored his ward to his belt. The ward unraveled like rope after a hard rain. The curved blade came up and touched the hollow of the throat. The body wavered by a hair, as if the world might choose to remember it on the next count. It did not. The body fell. Aranel stepped aside so it would not touch him. The platforms at the seam shifted as if pushed by hands. The Legion regrouped. More casters moved forward, drawn by the pull of the thing in the case. Red and purple brightened in the air until the grove looked like a cathedral lit from within by storms. Fourth, the Faye Rebellion. The forest decided to stop pretending it was only wood. Roots rose and braided together into walls high as a man's chest. Buds swelled and burst into flowers the size of shields. When the flowers opened, they released spores that drifted like silver pollen. The spores touched steel and drank it. Legion blades dulled, legion mail pitted. Hollow sentinels that had marched at the rear seized when threads of silver powder settled into their woven ribs. Their light guttered and steadied, then guttered again. Aranel moved among the Fae bands like a fixed star that had learned how to walk. He marked where fear gathered too thick and went there. He marked where confidence hardened into pride and went there also. Each time he brought the same medicine. Breath, count, movement, and a sentence that set the count into a rule simple enough to carry while running. Left foot on the word, right foot on the answer, he told a trio glued to a root by panic. Do not watch your death. Watch your friend's shoulders. Loose as you exhale, he told an archer whose hands shook. Loose on trust. The arrow knows the path when the breath shows it. Drop your shoulder, he told a swordsman who met force head-on. You are not a wall. You are a door that only opens one way. He did not accept a blow. Spells reached for him and found a man that had already chosen to be somewhere else. When they did not, his curved blade deflected their breath without letting the breath arrive. Laethra's voice rose until it shook leaves. The ash trees bent and then sprang, flinging entire curtains of thorn into the ranks. The prismatic eyes on the forward line brightened, and a wave of raw pressure rolled out. Thorn curtains lifted and dissolved. Laethra staggered, then steadied as vines caught her knees and lent them their sense of ground. She laughed once and raised her hands. The spring, tired of being told what to be, turned its climbing water into ropes that wrapped casters and dragged them against platforms where their own mirror plates showed them their fear. Some broke and ran back across the seam. Some smiled the hard smile of zeal and bit their tongues to keep from speaking doubt. The ley breaks open. The sky over the wilds tore again. This time it did not open into a room. It opened into Eruhol's crown itself. For a breath the dome appeared above the ash grove. Glass terraces hung in the air like necklaces thrown upward and caught. Stones from the city fell into the trees and turned into sheets of ley light that slid down trunks like rain. A balcony drifted, turned, and fell apart in a shower of ordered fragments that reassembled before they touched ground, then fell apart again because the ground refused their plan. The architect's voice passed through the grove. It did not speak words, it spoke grammar, the law under language. Everything that could hear it felt the urge to align. Roots tried to straighten. Leaves tried to turn to one angle and hold there. Bodies tried to stand the way statues stand. Aranel felt the voice on his teeth. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and spoke a count against it. 1 and 1 make 2, then 3. He said, low and steady. 3 and 5 make 8. 8 and 13 make breath. Laethra heard him and laughed again. She echoed him, her words not quite words, but the forest understood them. Vines loosened, leaves shook themselves free, bodies learned to bend again. Above them the seam brightened to a white line, and then flared. 2 figures stepped through that carried no armor and needed none. They were casters of the Legion, whose prismatic eyes blazed so hot that the colors bled into the skin around them. One lifted his palms, and the air turned to plates that slid together and apart, chopping the wind into sections. The other drew a circle in the air with one finger. Inside the circle space softened and twisted. Where he pointed the circle, Things drooped like wax under a summer sun. Aranel moved to meet them because, if he did not, no one else would reach the second line. He entered the falling plates at an angle and let them pass where he had been. A plate grazed his sleeve and took a thread of cloth. The thread vaporized with a smell like singed sugar. He arrived at the caster who had drawn the circle and held Verin's grace up so the circle could see itself. For a heartbeat, the circle tried to soften its own edge. It failed. In the confusion, the caster faltered. Aranel planted the heel of his palm on the man's sternum and pushed. The man stumbled back into his partner's plates. The plates chopped his breath into pieces, and he dropped with eyes still bright. Pride and surprise balanced in them like scales that could not decide. The second caster thrust a hand forward. The plates came for Aranel's head. He bent as if bowing to a queen. The plates shaved a lock of hair. He stepped inside the caster's reach and took his wrist. The bones under his fingers felt like polished tools. He rotated the hand, and the plates drifted off target and cut air. The curved blade touched the seam under the jaw. The plates stuttered and died. 6. The Faye stand. The battle did not end. It changed shape. The Legion lost ground where the grove leaned in, then gained where the seam poured new bodies into the basin. The wilds gave and took and gave. The ash roots were slick with sap. The spring had found gravity again, and now thundered sideways down a trench that had not existed an hour before. The air smelled like wet metal and crushed mint. Aranel found the center of the line because there was no other place for him. He faced the Faye bands with his back to the seam and raised his blade until their eyes found it. He spoke in the lull between one roar and the next. His voice was not a shout. It was the tone he used when he wanted a frightened child to hear a truth and keep it. Move through rhythm, not through fear. Turn when the drum turns. If you lose the drum, turn when your partner breathes. Keep your eyes where life still is. If you must choose, choose to live so you can fight again. The architect cannot count a dance that never ends. The drum answered him, soft at first, then louder as hands found it. The beat travelled from root to root, from band to band, until even the old beeches gave small knocks from their trunks as if to keep time. The Fae moved. It was not a charge. It was not a retreat. It was a braid, bodies interlacing so that no single life carried more than it could bear. Arrows rose and fell in waves that met the Legion's spells on the count, not a heartbeat before, not a breath after. Lethra stood to Aranel's right and sang until stones cracked. The seam that had been a wound began to look like a mouth that had eaten more than it could swallow. At last the platforms wavered. The casters who remained called orders that sounded like numbers falling down a stair. The prismatic eyes on the forward ranks flickered, red and purple fraying at their edges. One by one the platforms withdrew, sliding back through the seam like ships recalled by a tide. A handful of legionnaires tried to run under the trees and were caught by roots that lifted and set them aside, not dead, not free, but held until their breath learned the right shape again. Silence walked into the grove with slow feet. The drum faded. The wind arrived from one direction and kept to it. The ash trees straightened and let their leaves show green again. The spring fell back into its bed, then overran the bed with joy because it could. Where the storms had burned, new growth already showed, thin as threads and bright as new glass. Aranel stood with his hands on his knees and breathed until his heart remembered which count belonged to living. Blood trickled from a cut he had not noticed. He wiped it with the back of his wrist and looked for Lethra. She stood on the root where she had begun, hair damp with mist, eyes bright, face pale with too much power moved too fast. "They will come again," she said. "They will bring a different shape." "They will," Aranel said. He looked at the case, and then at the seam where the last gleam faded. We will go before they remember how." He turned to the bands and lifted his voice once more, because words can keep a line from breaking when sinew is tired and bone is full of ache. "We move in an hour," he said. "Eat, drink, hold your friend's hand if you must. When we go quiet. No trophies, names only, songs only. Today we live, tomorrow we live again." The wilds listened. The leaves breathed. Somewhere beyond the ridge a fox barked, not in fear, but in agreement. The Fae smiled without showing teeth. They sat and passed water and fruit and the bitter paste that keeps muscles from giving out. A child who had run messages through the last hour leaned his head on his mother's knee and slept. Aranel walked the edge of the grove until the smell of crushed mint turned to the clean odor of water over stone. He looked once at the eastern sky where dawn would come. He did not ask for gentleness. He asked for time and for feet that do not fail before they know how to stop. Behind him, the grove whispered over its wounds. Before him, the wilds waited with their own order that did not need a law to stand. He tightened the cloak around the case and went to find a quiet place to speak to the ones who would follow him through the next shape of chaos. Part 2. The Legion descends. I, the burning sky. The dawn came without warning. The horizon did not brighten. It erupted. Aranel looked up from where he knelt beside a wounded scout and saw the clouds buckle inward, twisting into a spiral of red and purple light. Each band pulsed in rhythm with a sound too deep to be heard, but too loud to ignore. The air thickened, growing heavy enough to bend the branches of the tallest trees. Above the Fey wilds, the architect's storm was forming. Leaves turned black on their undersides as ley currents screamed across the canopy. The once silver rivers of light became torrents, boiling through the sky and cracking open in flashes that showed things behind the veil. Shapes of impossible geometry and hollow faces built from light itself. Aranel rose to his feet, pulling the hood of his cloak tighter. The world's color had changed. Everything was tinted by the Legion's arrival. Even the soil bled crimson where the ley had ruptured. A scout staggered toward him, eyes wide, armor cracked and wet with sap. "The Legion, they are falling through the sky," she said. "Not marching." Falling. Aranel looked past her. The first wave broke through the storm in a rain of black glass and gold. The Chaos Legion dropped like meteors, armor flaring on impact. Red and purple prismatic eyes burned through the smoke. Each soldier carried a distortion field that bent the air around them. When the first one landed near the basin, the ground folded outward, crushing roots and throwing stones skyward. The soldier's staff struck the ground, and the ground answered with fire. "Positions!" Aranel called. "Hold the basin edge." "Watch for the casters. They come in pairs." The words steadied those close enough to hear. Lithra's voice followed, sharper and higher. "Root lines forward! Thorn walls awake!" The forest obeyed. 2. The wilds awaken. The first blast from the Legion's casters turned the ash trees white. Every branch within 20 paces ignited into powder. The Fae bent low as the Legion advanced, 4 ranks of crimson and violet, blades humming with stored ley energy. Their eyes glowed in harmony with the storm above. They raised their hands and cast in unison. The ground cracked. Rings of fire spread outward, expanding in spirals that burned green at their edges. From those spirals rose creatures shaped from the ley itself, semi-transparent beasts made of wind and molten stone. They roared without sound, their mouths opening wider than they should. Aranel moved first. He jumped from one root to another, the curved blade already in motion. He struck the first of the ley beasts through its neck. The impact scattered its form into droplets of liquid glass that hissed when they hit the soil. 2 Legion soldiers came at him next, both swinging halberds charged with violet energy. He sidestepped, feeling heat slice through the air near his shoulder, then struck one in the back of the knee. The blade bit deep. The soldier fell to one knee. Aranel's dagger, Verin's grace, slid upward in a clean arc, severing the ley wires connecting helmet to spine. The light in the soldier's eyes blinked out. The second soldier thrust his halberd forward, and Aranel twisted around it, grabbing the haft with one hand and pulling. The motion drew the man off balance. Aranel spun, reversed his grip, and slashed low. Sparks leapt from metal as the Legionnaire's armor split. He went down hard. A roar echoed through the grove. The ley beasts had reached the right flank. Fae archers released volleys of glass-tipped arrows, each one glowing faintly with bound spells. When the arrows struck, the beasts imploded, collapsing into clusters of violet mist that rolled across the roots like smoke. Lythra raised both arms and called upon the forest itself. The ground trembled as vines erupted from the soil, thick as cables, their tips sharpened to needle points. The vines impaled a wave of Legion soldiers and drew them screaming into the earth. Blood soaked into the roots and vanished. The architect's voice came again. It was not words, only a feeling the weight of being observed. Aranel looked up and saw an eye form in the clouds. It was the storm's core, a spiral of red and purple light that spun slowly, its gaze moving from army to army. "Do not stop," he called. "Do not look up. It is not looking for you. It is looking for me." Third, the firestorm. The next wave came from the east. Legion Magi appeared in circles of mirrored flame, each surrounded by attendants who chanted in metallic tones. Their eyes flared, and from their mouths came energy so pure it hummed like a blade being sharpened. Bolts of molten violet tore through the trees. Branches exploded. Whole sections of forest caught fire, then reformed as crystal, then shattered again as the ley surged. Aranel ran towards the center line, shouting to keep formation. The world around him had become chaos incarnate, a storm of magic and debris, light bending at random, sound twisting in the wrong direction. He moved through it as if walking through rain, calm and precise. Two casters saw him and raised their staves. Circles of glowing symbols spun into being above their heads. The symbols aligned, locking into place like a spell of geometry and death. Aranel rolled forward as the air where he had stood imploded. The blast sucked in sound and color, leaving a hollow cone in the air that filled with grey mist. He came up beneath one caster, slashing in a rising arc. The curved blade took the man's arm at the shoulder. Aranel stepped in, twisted the dagger, and drove it into the caster's chest. The second caster shouted an incantation, hurling a wave of pure ley energy. Aranel flung the dead caster's body into the path of the blast. The corpse absorbed most of it, erupting in a burst of bright shards. He dove through the flash, grabbed the surviving caster's wrist, and twisted hard enough to hear bones break. The caster screamed, purple light spilling from his eyes. Aranel's dagger silenced him. A blast to his right threw him to the ground. The impact tore his cloak, sending the case skidding across the dirt. For one terrifying moment, the prism's hum filled the air. The ley reacted, every color deepening, every sound muffled. The battle froze. Even the Legion faltered. Aranel crawled toward the case, each breath tasting like metal. The ground beneath him rippled. A fissure opened, wide enough to swallow a man. He threw the case across the gap and rolled after it as the fissure snapped shut. He caught it to his chest, pressing it against his heart until the hum subsided. When he opened his eyes, a ring of Legion soldiers had surrounded him, their red and purple gazes burning brighter than fire. One stepped forward. His armor was black and gold, and his staff carried a prism at its top, a fragment of the architect's own creation. The soldier's voice vibrated through the air like the ringing of metal. "You took what cannot be taken," he said. "Return it, and the law will forget your existence." Aranel stood slowly, dirt falling from his cloak. "You have no law," he said. "Only obedience." The soldier's prismatic eyes narrowed. "Then you will see what obedience becomes when it is perfected." He thrust the staff forward. 4. The duel at the edge grove. The world shattered around them. Trees bent backward, splitting at the roots. Aranel was flung into the air, twisting to land on his feet among the wreckage. The Legion commander strode forward through the chaos, staff burning with red light that carved through the air like molten glass. Aranel drew both weapons, the curved blade and Veren's grace. His stance shifted low, 1 foot behind the other. The commander struck first. A beam of energy erupted from his staff, turning soil into obsidian. Aranel dove aside, rolled, and came up close enough to strike. He slashed for the commander's midsection. The man caught the blow on the haft of his staff, sparks showering in violet arcs. The commander countered with a spin, sweeping the staff across Aranel's face. Aranel ducked under, planted a foot, and kicked the man's knee. Armor cracked. The commander staggered but did not fall. He raised his free hand and clenched his fist. The air solidified around Aranel. He felt invisible pressure clamp down, freezing his limbs. The world dimmed, colors draining from sight. He forced his lungs to move. "You think order is strength," he said through clenched teeth. "It is only fear that forgot how to bend." He pushed. The ley inside him, wild and untamed, surged through his veins. The invisible cage cracked. Light spilled from his fingertips as he broke the spell. He stepped forward and struck twice, once across the chest, once across the throat. The commander fell backward, choking on light. Aranel caught him before he hit the ground and whispered, "You should have bent." The commander's body dissolved into shards of violet glass. The air screamed as if something vast had noticed the death. The unmaking storm. Lightning tore across the sky, not white, not blue, but violet shot through with black. The ley above them fractured. Cracks appeared in the air, leaking brilliance so intense it turned shadows into silhouettes. Lythra appeared beside him, armor half melted, her silver thorn crown flickering with light. "We cannot hold," she said. "The ley line itself is breaking. It will take the forest with it." Aranel looked at the sky, then at the prism case in his arms. "Then we run before the world collapses." "Where?" "Anywhere it still breathes." The ground convulsed. Whole sections of the grove dropped several feet, throwing Fae and Legion alike into chaos. From the storm above, fragments of the architect's city fell, massive slabs of crystal and stone. They struck the forest, exploding into waves of fire and light. The Legion began to retreat, their casters screaming as the ley energy consumed them. Their prismatic eyes dimmed, then went dark. Aranel raised his blade once more. "Fall back!" Through the western gate. The Fae moved, pulling wounded with them. Lythra sang a word that made the trees open, forming a tunnel of living wood. The survivors poured through. Aranel stayed behind, watching as the storm devoured the grove. When the last of the Fae vanished into the tunnel, he turned and followed. Behind him, the basin that had once been the heart of the Fae wilds collapsed inward, consumed by a storm that sang in red and purple. 6. The price of survival. They emerged miles away, the ley gate spitting them out into a clearing ringed by silver reeds. The forest here was quiet, untouched by the chaos that had claimed the grove. The survivors gathered around Lythra. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "We lost half, but we are not broken." Aranel stood apart, wiping his blade clean with a strip of torn cloth. His hands trembled from exhaustion. The case lay beside him, faintly humming. Lythra approached, her gaze falling to the case. "The prism still hums," she said. "It calls to him." "I know," Aranel said. "And until I find a way to silence it, he will follow." She nodded. "Then we keep moving." The wilds will hide us for a while, but not forever. Aranel looked up at the sky. The storm was gone, but its color remained of a faint bruise stretching across the horizon. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Every law ends when it forgets mercy." He turned toward the west, where the forest grew darker, older, and less willing to listen. His cloak rippled in the wind as he stepped forward. Behind him, the survivors followed in silence. The sound of their movement faded, swallowed by the living forest. The ley quieted for the first time in hours. In that silence, far above, the architect storm began to turn once more. It would come again. It always did. And Aranel-the Faye Dancer walked deeper into the chaos that waited. Part 3. Dance of Blades. The shattered expanse. Night had no hold over the wilds anymore. The ley itself had become the sky. Rivers of light tore through the treetops, bending and twisting around invisible axes. Trees that once sang with quiet luminescence now burned in color so bright it seared the eyes. Red, violet, and silver chased each other across the heavens, painting the broken canopy in storms of living pigment. Aranel stood at the edge of a clearing where once there had been a tranquil glade. Now the ground rippled like water, and great shards of glass and root rose from the earth in uneven spires. Ley energy danced between them, thin as silk and fast as lightning. Lethra's forces were gathering nearby Fae archers, healers, wildcasters, and spirit-bound warriors. Each bore streaks of gold and silver light across their arms, gifts of the ley that had not yet burned them. Their faces were determined, beautiful, and tired. The air pulsed. Aranel felt it through his teeth. A new storm was forming, one deeper, richer, more deliberate. "They come again," Lethra said, stepping beside him. Her voice carried a quiet fury. "He will not stop sending them." "He will," Aranel replied. His hand rested on the hilt of his curved blade. "When there is nothing left to send." The forest trembled. Every leaf turned upward. A second later, the sky cracked open. The legion fell from the breach in formation. 200 strong. Each soldier's eyes blazed in twin bands of prismatic red and purple, swirling in opposite directions like storms in glass. Their armor gleamed with color so bright it hurt to look at, every plate humming with charged ley glyphs. They hit the ground in silence, and the world around them shifted in obedience. Second, the first wave. Spells began before the soldiers even landed. Streams of violet fire carved through the trees, spiraling around trunks and exploding into ribbons that turned to mist. Bolts of crimson lightning followed, each strike fracturing the ground into floating shards. Fae defenders raised walls of living wood. The first bolts shattered them like brittle glass. The second wave melted what was left. Aranel moved. He darted between flashes of energy, cloak billowing behind him, the curved blade already alive in his hand. When he swung, the air itself bent around the edge. The first legionnaire he met cast a spell of binding, threads of white light that whipped through the air like chains. Aranel stepped through them. Each thread snapped as if cut by an unseen rhythm. His blade found the gap between plates and slid clean through. The dead man fell, his armor scattering into shards of crimson light that burned for a moment before vanishing. Another came. Aranel met the halberd's downswing with Verin's grace, the small dagger gleaming like moonlight. Sparks burst into violet arcs that wrapped around both weapons. For a second the world was all color, motion, and song. Aranel pivoted, pressed forward, and drew the curved blade up through the soldier's chest. Each kill made the ley pulse brighter. Each death called attention. "Archers!" he shouted, voice cutting through chaos. "Aim for the prisms in their armor, not the eyes." The Fae obeyed. Their arrows streaked in glowing gold arcs, each one trailing a line of silver fire. The arrows struck the Legion's armor, shattering crystalline cores and turning them into bursts of fractured color. The sky filled with rain made of light. The smell of ozone and burning ley filled the air. Third, the battle turns. The architect's soldiers adapted quickly. Casters raised their staves high, forming circles in the air that began to spin. Within those circles, galaxies of red and violet whirled. Energy built, humming like 1,000 violins. Then it came. The world exploded in brilliance. Lines of red light swept across the battlefield, carving perfect geometries into the air. Every line became a wall, every wall a cage. Within seconds, Fae soldiers were trapped in prisons of living energy. Some screamed as the walls closed, folding into themselves like mirrors crushing reflections. Lethra sang, voice low and resonant. The vines at her feet twisted, turning black before bursting into luminous silver. The ground cracked, and from it erupted flowers with petals like blades. Each bloom launched a storm of razor-sharp light into the sky, tearing through the cages. The trapped Fae fell free. Aranel saw Lethra fall to one knee, her arm bleeding from a burn that refused to close. He leapt to her side, cutting down 2 Legion soldiers who tried to reach her. Their armor disintegrated in showers of color. "Stay behind the front," he said. "I will not," she replied, voice sharp. "The wilds still answer to me." She raised her arm and sent another pulse into the ley. The trees bent and screamed. The wilds obeyed, for the dance. A horn sounded, one Aranel had not heard before. The pitch was wrong, the resonance too perfect. Every legionnaire turned as one. A commander stepped from the breach. His armor was pure prismatic glass, reflecting every color of the ley. His eyes were twin stars of red and violet light. When he raised his hand, the ground fractured beneath him. The commander spoke. His voice carried through magic, a note of command so strong it felt physical. "All movement will end." The spell rippled outward. The ley itself obeyed. For a moment, the world froze. Aranel's heart beat once, but the sound was distant, slow. He could see the blades of grass frozen in mid-bend, droplets of water hanging motionless in the air. Fae and Legion alike were caught in the spell. Only Aranel moved. The Fae magic within him rebelled against stillness. It shimmered through his blood like light through glass. He felt the ley's pressure pressing against him, trying to hold him still, but his body refused. His heartbeat matched a rhythm older than the architect's law, the rhythm of the wilds. He stepped forward. Each step shattered the spell around him. The frozen air rippled, color returning to it. The world stirred. The Legion commander turned, eyes narrowing. He raised both hands and cast. Spells poured from him in waves, spirals of purple fire, orbs of red light that exploded into mirrors, shards of black glass that sliced through air like blades. Aranel moved through it all. He became motion given form. Each strike was an answer to the architect's order, each step a refusal to stop. He danced. His blade cut through flame, bending light away. His dagger spun in his left hand, catching shards and turning them back on their casters. Sparks of every color filled the air, blue from ley shields breaking, gold from Fae spells answering, red from the Legion's fire. The entire battlefield became a storm of light. Aranel's movements wove through it all. He leapt from root to root, striking, parrying, twisting. To those who saw him, it looked like he moved with 2 bodies, one of flesh, one of color. Everywhere he went, the wilds fought harder. Lethra rose again, voice joining his motion. Her song bent around his rhythm. Together they turned the chaos into something beautiful. A war fought as dance, each blade and note part of the same creation. The commander's spells grew more frantic. He called down lightning that burned violet white. The sky cracked and bled color. The ley tore itself open. Aranel charged. Their weapons met in a burst of brilliance that lit the forest brighter than dawn. The impact sent waves of raw energy through the air. Colors swirled and bled into each other, red into blue, gold into white, purple into silver. V. The final strike. The commander screamed, his prismatic eyes burning brighter. You cannot unmake perfection. Perfection isn't alive, Aranel said, and drove both blades forward. Verin's grace struck first, piercing the prism embedded in the man's armor. The curved blade followed, cleaving through both shoulders in one fluid motion. Light poured from the wounds, cascading upward in pillars of red and purple flame. The commander fell, his armor collapsing inward like melting glass. The ley screamed as it lost another of its anchors. Aranel fell to one knee, breathing hard. The world trembled around him. The battle was ending, but the ley did not stop. It had tasted freedom and could not return to silence. Lythra approached, her silver vines trailing behind her. The ley won't rest, she said. You've cut too deep. I did what I had to, he said, rising. If the world must learn to move again, let it start here. 6. The sky of color. The battlefield burned with beauty. Spells still lingered in the air, drifting upward like lanterns. Blue fire mingled with silver pollen. Crimson light spiraled upward in slow arcs. The trees glowed from within, sap flowing in patterns that looked almost human. Fae survivors knelt among the roots, tending to the wounded. The legion had vanished. Their remains scattered in prisms that still hummed faintly. Above them, the storm was changing. The red and purple rings began to fade, replaced by soft gold and silver threads that shimmered across the sky like veins of living light. The ley was not healing, but transforming. Aranel sheathed his weapons and looked towards the horizon. He will feel this, he said quietly. Every crack, every breath, he will come himself next time. Lythra stepped beside him, her arm glowing faintly where it had healed. Then we will be ready. They stood together beneath the kaleidoscope sky as dawn returned. The ley storms dimmed, leaving streaks of color that would never fade. For the first time in centuries, the wilds were truly alive. And at the heart of it all stood Aranel-the Faye Dancer, his blades dripping with light, his eyes reflecting a world reborn. Part 4. The Wild's Answer. I, the breath of the ley. The morning after the battle smelled of rain, though no rain had fallen. The air was thick, trembling with aftershocks of magic. Every branch hummed with residual power, and the ground glowed faintly, as though a fire still burned far beneath it. Aranel moved through the wreckage in silence. Each step sent ripples of color through the soil, silver and green pulsing like the slow beat of a heart. The ley was awake now, not just flowing, not just feeding the world, but it's aware. Everywhere around him the forest breathed. Trees stretched as though testing their own limbs. Flowers opened in impossible hues, colors that shifted too fast for the eye to name. He touched one of the roots that had risen during the fight. It was warm. Beneath his fingers he could feel it pulsing, not like sap, but like blood. The ley had learned motion. Lythra stood at the basin's edge where water once reflected the canopy. Now the spring was gone, replaced by a circle of glass that mirrored the sky. Her eyes were shadowed, the silver thorns in her hair dimmed. The forest dreams while waking, she said. It no longer needs us to speak for it. Aranel turned to her, cloak brushing the glowing ground. Dreams always need witnesses, he said. Otherwise they fade into madness. She smiled faintly. And which are we? He didn't answer. The sound began, a deep note that shook the air without wind. The trees quivered, their branches pulling inward. Birds fell silent. The color that had glowed in the soil began to gather, drawn toward the center of the ruined grove. "Lythra," Aranel said softly. "It's forming." The ley was creating a body. 2. The birth of the wilds. The light condensed into a sphere the size of a man's head. It pulsed once, twice, then expanded, drawing matter from the forest floor. Roots twisted upward, weaving themselves into the shape of limbs. Bark turned smooth as skin, then rippled with veins of light. Within moments, a form stood before them. Tall, slender, neither fey nor human. Its eyes were twin rings of molten color, turning endlessly through every hue of the ley. When it moved, it did not disturb the ground. Lythra fell to one knee. The wilds have taken shape. The being tilted its head, and when it spoke, the air shimmered with sound. "We are awake. We remember everything that has been taken." Aranel stepped forward cautiously. "The architect will come for you. You must hide, or he will twist you into his next law." "We do not hide," the being said. "We grow." Its hand extended, palm open, and the ground responded. Trees nearby burst upward, their roots tearing free of the soil, branches stretching toward the light. Flowers bloomed across the trunks in patterns that spiraled outward like galaxies. The ley had become a living consciousness, a fusion of memory, magic, and instinct. It was beauty given will. It was already losing balance. Lythra whispered, "It's too much. It's feeding itself." Aranel raised his blade slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Then we cut where we must." 3rd. The Bloomstorm. The wild screamed. It was not a sound made by throat or tongue, but by every leaf, every blade of grass, every drop of ley-infused dew. The air filled with luminescent pollen that burned like embers. The light from the ground rose in columns, forming shapes, faces, beasts, spirits, all howling in unison. Lythra covered her ears, though the sound came from within. "It's remembering everything, every life, every death." Aranel stood his ground as the ley energy thickened around him. Colors exploded in the sky, prismatic lightning and raw creation. Threads of green twisted into violet, blue into crimson, white into gold. The entire world seemed to paint itself anew every second. From within the bloom of light, figures emerged, not legion, not fey. Constructs of memory, warriors from both sides, made of light and dust, reenacting the endless war between order and chaos. They clashed without thought, each strike creating another explosion of color. Aranel's vision blurred. Every motion left trails of himself, every breath came with echoes of light. The ley was rewriting time itself. "Aranel!" Lythra's voice cut through the brilliance. "We must anchor it before it consumes the wilds." He nodded, drawing both weapons. "Guide the song. I'll guide the blade." She began to sing, a slow, haunting melody that rippled through the air like water over stone. Her song carried the pattern of the old ley, the one that had existed before the architect's order. The wilds hesitated, its rage flickering. Aranel moved. He leapt into the air, cutting through strands of light that had begun to bind the trees together. Each stroke severed a knot of energy, sending ripples across the grove. His blades shone with pure silver, the color of freedom itself. The wilds retaliated. Roots lunged upward, enormous and glowing, seeking to pull him down. He landed atop one and sprinted across it, his movements precise, each step leaving a trail of fading blue. Lythra's song rose higher, stronger, harmonizing with the hum of the ley. The storm of colour shifted around her, forming a spiral. Aranel reached the heart of the storm, the being that called itself the Wilds. It watched him with eyes of fire and rain. "You would cut life to save it?" it asked, voice calm amid the chaos. "I would cut the chain that binds it," he said, and drove both blades into the ground. 4. The heart of the ley. Light erupted outward. Every colour collided, red crashing into blue, green into silver, violet into gold. The world lost form for a moment. There was no up, no down, no sky, no ground, only motion and colour. Aranel floated in the centre of it all, arms outstretched, the hilts of his weapons burning in his hands. The ley tried to read him, tried to write him, but it could not. His rhythm was not one it could measure. Lythra's song reached its peak. She stood within a circle of her own making, vines spiralling around her like a crown. "Aranel!" she called. "Now!" He pulled the blades apart. The ley screamed, and the world cracked open. The energy condensed into a sphere of pure white light. It hovered between them, pulsing like a living heart. Then, slowly, the colour began to fade. The forest settled. The pollen fell like gentle snow. The being's voice returned, softer now. "We will sleep until called again. Guard what we have given you." Then it was gone. The ley quieted. The trees stopped moving. The world exhaled. The afterglow. When the light faded, Aranel knelt among the ruins of the grove. His blades were dim, the runes along their edges dulled. The prism in his satchel pulsed faintly, slower than before. Lythra approached, her voice hoarse. "You spoke to it." "I did," he said. "It was never meant to obey or destroy, only to remember. The wilds will remember you now," she said. He sheathed his blades and looked toward the rising sun. The sky shimmered faintly, still stained with traces of the battle, ribbons of violet and gold crossing the horizon. "The architect will feel this," he murmured. "He will see what happens when life refuses to stop moving." Lythra nodded. "And he will come himself." Aranel smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "Then let him." He turned toward the west, where the forest grew darker, ancient beyond memory. The light followed him for a few steps before dimming, leaving only footprints that glowed for a moment and then vanished. The Faye Dancer walked on, the man who had stolen from gods, awakened forests, and taught the ley itself how to dance. And somewhere far above, in the endless structure of the architect's mind, a fragment of thought stirred. He has learned to move faster than perfection. Chapter 3. The Last Dance. The fragment of the architect. I, the silence before the storm. The forest had never been this still. The air carried a faint taste of copper and ozone, the aftertaste of too much creation burned too fast. The trees stood motionless, not dead but waiting, their roots sunk deep into soil that pulsed faintly with dim silver veins. Above, the sky no longer burned with ley fire. It had cooled into a soft white haze, like a scar across heaven. Aranel walked alone. His boots sank into soft moss that glowed faintly under each step, marking his path with silver footprints that faded moments later. The air around him shimmered, carrying faint echoes of what the wilds had said before it dissolved. We remember. He could still hear that hum inside his bones. Every breath, every heartbeat resonated faintly with the ley. It did not hurt. It simply reminded him that he was still part of what he had freed. When the trees thinned, he saw her. The archfey stood upon a hill of glass and ivy, the morning light tracing pale ribbons through her hair. She wore no armor, only woven silver cloth that rippled as though alive. The air bent slightly around her. shimmering with power older than the forest itself. "Aranel," she said softly, "the ley trembles when you walk. You have carried the rhythm too far." He bowed his head slightly. "The world will need rhythm to survive what comes next." She smiled, faint but knowing. "It already knows the steps. But you are tired." "I have no time for rest." The Archfae's eyes lifted towards the east, where the horizon boiled with faint red light. "Then neither do I." The light grew brighter. It was not dawn. It was the return of something vast, something that had never truly left. The architect had sent a piece of himself. 2. The sky opens. The eastern horizon split open. Not a tear this time, but a deliberate wound. The air screamed as red and purple light poured through it, twisting the clouds into geometric spirals that rotated with impossible precision. Every leaf in the forest tilted toward it, trembling as the ley shuddered in fear. Then came the sound, structure itself groaning under strain. A shape emerged from the rupture. It was not a man, nor a machine, nor a god. It was the idea of order given form, a fragment of the architect, cast into the world like a sword through silk. Its body was made of transparent crystal, shot through with veins of light. Its face had no mouth, no eyes, only shifting symmetry. Yet Aranel felt its gaze all the same. The Archfae's hand rose. "This is no army," she said. "It is what remains when the architect no longer trusts creation to act for him." The fragment moved. It did not walk. It rearranged space around itself, stepping through points that should not exist. Each movement left behind a bloom of energy, a shape of light that hung suspended in air like a memory refusing to fade. Aranel's hand tightened on his blade. "He sends his mind when his body cannot cross. Then I will cut thought itself." The Archfae placed her hand on his shoulder. "Not alone. The wilds remember you, and they will answer again." She stepped forward, spreading her fingers. Silver light poured from her hands, running down her arms like rivers. The forest awoke once more, vines trembling, petals opening, light gathering at the roots. The fragment halted. Its form brightened until it was nearly blinding. The sound that came from it was both beautiful and terrible. A choir of thousands speaking at once, every voice in harmony and yet none human. "Return what you stole! Restore the balance!" Aranel raised his blade. "Balance was a cage." I gave it breath. 3rd, the clash of light. The world exploded. The fragment released its first spell M, a sphere of red and violet light that expanded outward, bending trees, breaking rock, and unraveling the ley itself. Where it passed, reality rippled like disturbed water. Aranel leapt through it. His cloak caught fire in every color, his blade glowing silver white as he cut through the energy. Sparks of red and gold burst around him, fragments of laws rewritten in an instant. He landed on a rising root and launched himself toward the fragment. Each movement was a note, each strike a beat in the symphony of chaos. His blade clashed against the crystal arm of the being, sending fractures of color cascading through the air. The Archfae sang behind him. Her voice shook the forest. Silver vines erupted from the earth, coiling around the fragment's legs. Every note she sang added color to the air. Emerald, sapphire, white, and gold, painting the battle like a living tapestry. The fragment countered. Its body pulsed, and the vines turned to ash. Beams of purple fire tore through the canopy, slicing trunks and setting the sky ablaze. It reached for Aranel, its form stretching across space like a reflection across a shattered mirror. Aranel ducked, spun, and struck upward, his blade carving through its arm. The cut left behind a spray of prismatic shards that exploded mid-air into crimson lightning. He was thrown back, crashing through a half-burned oak. He rolled to his feet, panting. The fragment advanced, every movement bending the air. The Archfey's song changed. It became lower, slower, the rhythm of creation itself. The ley responded, glowing brighter beneath the forest floor. Aranel looked at her, realization dawning. "You're binding it." She nodded once, her eyes glowing like twin moons. "I cannot hold him long. Then I'll finish the measure." He charged. 4. The heartbeat of the ley. The world had lost all color except light. Every tree, every rock, every blade of grass now glowed in shades of gold and violet. Time itself slowed, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. Aranel reached the fragment in a blur of motion. His curved blade met the being's core, a sphere of pulsing red light, and struck. The impact shattered sound itself. He was blinded. The ley screamed, but it was not in pain. It was singing. Every living thing joined the song, the trees, the soil, even the wind. The melody was vast and endless, an ancient chord that had slept for millennia. The fragment convulsed. Its form cracked, leaking energy that twisted into ribbons of fire. It raised both arms, attempting to cast again. But the Archfey's song held it in place. Her voice grew raw, the sound tearing at her throat. Silver light poured from her eyes. "Aranel!" she cried. "End it now!" He stepped closer, every muscle screaming, and plunged Verin's grace into the fragment's heart. For a moment, the world stopped. Then the light exploded outward in every direction. Colors erupted, crimson bleeding into blue, violet collapsing into gold, silver cutting through shadow. It was not destruction, it was transformation. The fragment screamed as it dissolved into light. Its last words were not rage, but wonder. "You have taught the law to move." The fade. The blast knocked Aranel backward. He landed beside the Archfey, who had fallen to her knees. Her hands trembled, the glow fading from her skin. The air was still filled with color, swirling like slow smoke. Each ribbon of light drifted upward, fading into the clouds. The ley had gone quiet again, not dead, but resting. Lythra and the Fae survivors reached the hill moments later. When they saw the sky, they stopped. Aranel knelt beside the Archfey, his face pale. "It's done," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Not done. Begun." Her form shimmered, fading into motes of silver light. "The wilds will remember your steps, dancer. Wherever the ley moves, so will you." He reached for her, but his hand passed through light. Then she was gone. The forest exhaled, and for the first time in centuries, there was peace. Aranel stood alone. The sky above shimmered softly, filled with faint ribbons of color that moved like music made visible. He could feel the ley beneath his feet, no longer bound, no longer silent. He smiled faintly. "Keep moving," he whispered to no one. "That's all I ever asked." He took one step forward, vanished, leaving behind only footprints glowing faintly in the moss. 6. The legend. No one saw where he went. Some said he became part of the ley, dancing within its streams wherever the wilds still grew. Others claimed he crossed into the spaces between creation, chasing the architect's fading echoes. But every few generations, when the forest shivers with color and the air hums with unseen rhythm, the Fae whisper the same thing. That somewhere in the heart of the wilds, when the ley glows silver and violet and the air smells of rain and light, a lone figure moves between the trees, an elf with twin blades, his cloak trailing sparks, his eyes filled with every color the world ever forgot, the one who taught perfection how to dance. Aranel, the Faye Dancer,